Gosh, I did not come here expecting that I would have my own big shoes to fill, so thank you for setting me up like that. My name is Max Elder. I am here today to talk to you about a presentation that I am calling In Our Own Image, Artifacts from the Future of Cultured Meat. There was a wonderful question from the last panel, from the last presentation, that someone over here asked about the imagery of traditional cattle farmers. Who was that? What's your name? Jim. Jim, that was a great question. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit more about imagery and about imagination. Did I lose anyone in that? No, good. This is a really, I think, profoundly important topic that often in these types of convenings, workshops, conferences, gets totally overlooked and underappreciated. Before I jump into that, I just want to let you all know the organization I work for. It's called the Institute for the Future. It's the world's leading futures thinking organization. We are 51, turning 52 years old. And for that long history, businesses, governments, foundations, NGOs have relied on our forecasts, our research, our custom work, and our trainings to navigate a world that is constantly in flux. And we are a nonprofit based down the road in Palo Alto, California. I am a research director in our Food Futures Lab, and we work with folks across the global food value chain to think more systematically about the future. One of our core missions is to convince people that the future is not something that happens to us. It is not something that is coming on the horizon and we are sort of helplessly dealing with and reacting to when it gets here. The future instead is something that we create. It's something that we build based on the decisions that we all make today, and that we can be much more systematic, creative, provocative, and thoughtful in building preferred futures and being very thoughtful about the decisions we make today and how they impact long-term futures. We're often very short-sighted in the decisions that we make. One of my colleagues, our director of games research and development, Jane McGonigal, has this wonderful quote that I thought we'd start off with. She says that in order to create something new, or really make any kind of change in the world, you first need to imagine how things can be different. And I actually think this is more profound than I guess I gave it credit for initially. In order to do any sort of change in the world, you have to be able to imagine first that that change could manifest, that you could do something differently. And so I went and looked up the etymology of the word imagination, and it turns out that when you go back in history and you look at where that word came from, it goes back to the Latin word for an image. And this makes a lot of sense. Like if you close your eyes and you imagine something, what you're really doing is coming up with an image in your mind. So if we need to imagine new futures, new possibilities, if we need to imagine change, we really need to focus on imagery and the images that we use that set the context for that change. And it turns out that the images that we've created about the future usually really set important directionality for how that future actually unfolds. That the images, the speculative images of what's possible, ends up setting boundaries for what happens in the future. We can be much better about coming up with images. So, if in order to create something new, you have to imagine how things can be different, I think what this really means is that in order to imagine how things can be different, we first need to come up with really good images of what's possible. So, what is possible today for cultured meat? Last night I went on Google, I went to images, and I typed in cultured meat. These are the most popular images. I also thought, okay, this has been called a lot of different terms. What does clean meat look like? What does cultivated meat look like? Or what does cell-based meat look like? Raise your hand if you think that these images are interesting, provocative, delicious, moving, inspiring. Is this the future that we want to build or are trying to build? I hope not, and I don't think so. So the question really becomes, what do the images that we even have available to us and our imaginations, what do they mean for the future? How are they biasing the way that we even think, design, build companies, communicate? First, I think today's images really make us think of these products as lab-grown. And everyone in the room I know says these are not going to be grown in a lab. This is a total mischaracterization. But the images that we have don't support that. So they make us think that these products will be lab grown. They also kind of bias us towards thinking that these products are going to be limited to very traditional form factors. You see a lot of like hamburgers, maybe some chicken nuggets. Most of the imagery primarily focuses on beef. It also, weirdly enough, contains what seemingly appear to be white male scientists. And I cannot get over this blue glove petri dish image that seems to dominate every single visual aid we use in this space. It looks like a science experiment, which no one wants to eat, right? Quite frankly, all of these images look disgusting. And none of these are intentional, I think, which is the more profound point. The problem is we're not intentionally coming up with good imagery for the space, and these images are actually really, really important, much more important than I think we really realize. They crystallize as a frame of reference for how we can even think, for how we can imagine what is possible. They also, on a perhaps equally important level, they frame consumer perceptions in very real ways. If someone has no idea what this is, they go to Google and they search for what it looks like, you're going to lose everyone kind of immediately, I suspect. So, what do we do about this? How do we imagine broader possibilities for the future, and in particular for the future of cultured meat? This is a visual framework called the Cone of Possibility, which looks at time and what's possible. And it turns out that the farther out into the future you go, the more becomes possible. In the next 60 seconds, I'll probably still be in this room talking to you. Next 5 minutes, that's probably the case, although some of you may have left. But in a year, in 5 years, we may all be in different jobs, we may be in different countries, we may have different people living in our homes. So as we go out farther into time, more becomes possible. But the way that we think, I think often, and particularly the images that we use, focuses very narrowly on what is most probable, perhaps what's plausible. But our work at the Institute for the Future really lies in playing in this sweet spot of where the real magic happens, where the real strategic, insightful thinking can occur, which is to push people's notions and really boundaries of what's possible in order to think broadly, creatively, imaginatively about different types of futures we could build. So we want to play in that notion of what's possible. One of the ways that we do it is through images. We at the Institute for the Future create what we call artifacts from the future. And I want to talk to you today about what those artifacts look like, what they could look like, and encourage you all to build your own, to imagine what artifacts from the future of cultured meat could be in the next 10 years. So, just like an archaeologist might go around the world and try to collect artifacts to paint a picture of an unknown past, right? We see these artifacts that have been left, and we use them to tell stories about values, about experiences, about social hierarchies. And these are sort of warm data, they're sort of fuzzy input to telling a story that is uncertain. It turns out that the future is often equally as uncertain as some of our past experiences, cultures. And we can go into the future, imagine what might be there, create visual representations of those kinds of artifacts to tell a story, to tell a narrative about what it means to eat cultured meat, not just what the petri dish could look like. And these types of images can take all kinds of form factors. They can look like bumper stickers, they can be labels for food, they can be food experiences. The Institute for the Future makes both two-dimensional visual objects, but also three-dimensional things you can interact with. And the sky is the limit in terms of what these really look like. The main point, though, is that they need to be grounded in present-day facts, and they need to be provocative. They need to help us think differently. They need to push our boundaries and notions of what's possible. And artifacts are wonderful. We use them all the time, and they're really, really good ways of getting a tangible experience of the future. There's no cultured meat product on the market today. If you want to talk to someone about what this might mean for them, I think the more important thing is to have them feel like they could possibly eat it and give them the experience of what that feels like. They also need some more concrete details. So much of this is very abstract, it's a nascent industry, and there are a lot of unknowns. What is this product going to ultimately be labeled as? We have all of these questions, And instead of just vaguely talking about the very complicated and nuanced theoretical challenges that we all face, we can make some speculative notions of what could be possible to make some of these ideas very much more concrete, because people need that type of concrete thing to interact with to understand. Artifacts from the future also help translate the trends that we are seeing in the present and some of the innovations that we're seeing on the edges of some of these systems that are small scale. They haven't totally scaled yet. They might be in a specific geography. They might be in a specific startup. But we could use that type of evidence from today, push those out in 10 years, and imagine what would happen if they scaled and combined in unique ways to come up with these visions. So what I don't want you all to do is just imagine. I want you to use real evidence from the present as the foundation upon which you come up with new visions of the future. These types of artifacts actually are really helpful at providing a rich starting point for strategic conversations. You can use these types of visual aids to ask yourself, what would it really look like if we were designing one of these products? Not in the abstract, but really, what would the product look like, and what would the label look like? We actually need to talk about these types of things. How does a consumer interact with it? And not just a consumer, how does a mother use this to feed her kids? And how does that look different? The more concrete and specific we can get with these types of images, the better. And all of them are really supposed to challenge some assumptions that we have about the future. Challenge assumptions about what a farmer might look like who's growing cultured meat. Challenge the type of consumer that we think would eat this product. Challenge even the form factor in which it might come. Challenge all of our assumptions, because those assumptions end up blinding us and really setting a very narrow direction for how this space might unfold over the next 10 years. Finally, the whole purpose is to create better futures, to create more preferred futures for different stakeholders. And the beautiful thing about images of the future, the beautiful thing about these kinds of artifacts, is that they make our values very explicit. They are a clear vision of possibility that we've designed, and we can be really clear about where we want to go there, and we can be very flexible about the strategies we end up enacting in order to get there. But that clarity is really important. And quite frankly, I have seen very, very few clear images of what this space looks like when it is mature. And if you all have seen really interesting and good ones, share them with me after. I'd love to see them. A few folks do it somewhat well, but we need many more people to do this in all different parts of the world, and this needs to be a much more democratic process. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the problems that plague our food system today are due to the fact that a small number of people actually put the space, time, resources necessary to come up with really compelling visions of how they want to see the future. And those visions set clear strategy roadmaps for how to build those futures, and it is not evenly distributed. So, I'm going to quickly share a few examples of artifacts from the future that the Institute has come up with that are supposed to be provocative. And the first thing I want to say here is that none of our strategic forecasting work involves predictions. We do not predict the future. If anyone wants to tell you, I had a conversation this morning about predictions in this space. If anyone has a prediction for the future of cultured meat, shake their hand and walk away. Those are not the people you want to be talking to. No one knows. The future is uncertain. Instead, these are supposed to be optimized not for a prediction, but instead for a provocation. We're trying to force people to actually think differently about how some of these things might unfold over the next 10 years. So this is an example. There's a narrative of what this is and what it means on our website that you can very easily find. But this is called Lunch or Bios. It's a synthetic biology lunch combination. You'll see a small bioreactor in the corner, cultured cheddar with ham and crackers. There's a yeast and nutrient mix included. There's some other interesting little components to this. There's a pro-GMO product certification in the bottom corner that pushes us to explore, really, like, what would it mean if younger people were playing with this? What would the next edible schoolyard be if it was in a science classroom? What would that look like? What are the attitudes around synthetic biology and food consumption across age demographics? Who might be the early adopters of some of these products? How do we make these things more engaging and playful? And what would it look like if this actually manifested in a product that is somewhat familiar to us, but slightly remixed? Now, this is not something that we just came up with. One of the processes we use in order to design some of these artifacts, we scan for what we call signals of change. These are small-scale, hyperlocal innovations. There's something new. It's a new product, a patent, a business model, it's a new behavior, a new technology. And we use those small-scale innovations in combination to come up with new visions of what could be possible. So what are some, think to yourselves right now, like where do you see in the food system instances that could support a product, an experience like this? There are many. One, of course, is in the East Bay, Perfect Day. They're producing flora-based milk and dairy products, and they've made ice cream, and they've initially rolled out that product in a really playful way, and they're already setting the stage for consumers to be more comfortable with the concept of fermented foods and using microorganisms as a base for production. Amino Labs is a spin-off of MIT. They've created very small-scale, very playful bioreactors that are targeted towards middle and high schoolers to get young people to see biology as something that they can play with and build, to design things. They're very fun, and you can imagine if a whole host of kids are playing with small-scale bioreactors in their classrooms at a young age, how that reframes their approach to all kinds of things, including the food, perhaps at their lunch table. Improved Nature is a new plant-based food company. They have a delicious chicken product today. They're rolling them out in school districts. One of the most interesting things is that the creator of Lunchables, Dr. Roddy Hawkins, he founded this company. So some of the core meat scientists who were involved in Lunchables are now moving towards the alternative protein sector, which points towards a possible future where these even core products that we're very familiar with have been remixed or redesigned. And then Soylent. Does anyone here drink Soylent? A few? Okay. Soylent has unabashedly started a very large public campaign for pro-science, pro-GMO attitudes. They've put up gigantic billboards that just say pro-GMO, and they're trying to at least, I so love their effort, they're trying to reshape the public perception and just conversation around genetically modified organisms. So what might it look like if now even there are large consumer campaigns focused on reorienting our notions to organisms and how we might modify them? What does it look like when all of these types of small-scale signals change, and what new thing might emerge, what new experience, what new product, what new behavior when these things scale? This is one possibility. There are a million different possibilities, and there are a million other signals that could support that type of visual generation. The Institute has a whole host of these artifacts on our website. The Food Futures Lab has come up with a few other ones related to cultured meat. This is Churchill's Carnery. It's a review of a very, very popular carnery in Sydney. And this really, I love when we made this because it forced us to ask ourselves profound questions that we'd never thought of, like what does the atmosphere feel like in a place like this? And how is it different? And then how would we want to design a different atmosphere to create people feeling comfortable, create the conditions for people to feel very comfortable and engaged? What would be on the menu? How might you be able to experience this type of food production in a new way? These images and just the process of making them forces us to ask really, really, I think, interesting and strategic questions for decisions that we might make today. We've also made artifacts about how you might gamify microbial diversity in your gut. We've made a whole host of these. I would encourage you to look at them online, and many others have done the same. So the talk is called In Our Own Image for a particular reason, and there are actually mainly two ones. The first is that we desperately need better images. Images of the future reflect just as much about our present values as they reflect our future values. This is a cartoon from the Chicago Tribune in 1960. Has this really interesting, provocative idea of probably a dynamic educational platform where a student is sitting at home and learning. The questions are probably pretty dynamic. If he's doing well, he gets harder questions. Kind of looks like an iPad, eerily enough. Does anyone notice anything a little odd or strange about the values that are manifested in this type of image? There's a woman cooking, and there's a man learning. The types of social and gender and political values embedded in our images of the future really tell us not only about the future, but about us today in the present. And we need to come up with much better visions of what becomes possible. This sets a direction for us to design tests and these types of educational environments for a particular type of person. And we can think much more broadly and creatively about who we're designing even these products for. The other is that there's a real power. There's a very profound power in creating new images, in creating images of anything new, anything possible. And unfortunately, a lot of the power and a lot of the folks who do that in the food system today are, I think, not the folks we want to come up with the visions of our futures. And we all need to be better at enabling, empowering, and emboldening all kinds of folks to think about the food future that they want and ask them what it looks like and give them some steps in order to create those visions. So I'm going to leave you all with 4 quick steps for how you might go about doing this, how you might create your own images for the future of cultured meat. And the first one is born out of a quote from Professor Jim Dater, who's sort of the father of futures studies at the University of Hawaii. And Jim says that any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. Any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. Any image of the future should also appear ridiculous. If it doesn't feel ridiculous, if a pro-GMO certified label doesn't feel ridiculous to you, then we need to push it farther because we need to be provocative. And we also need to appreciate that there is utility in being ridiculous. And it's much better to be scared by or frightened by one of these forecasts. It's much better to have an emotional response to one than to just continue on with business as usual, assuming that the future is going to look like what we think it will look like and being totally blindsided by what ends up happening. So can you seriously engage with the ridiculous in a meaningful way to come up with some of these visions? Has anyone read any William Gibson here? Science fiction writer, a few people? I've never read anything by William Gibson. But he has this great quote called, he says, the future's already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And I love this idea that in many ways, the future is here. These small-scale signals of change are here. We just heard about co-culturing muscle tissue in space. That is a possible future. That's here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And so what we do is we scan the world for these small-scale signals of change that challenge some of our assumptions and that provide us input that's based on real facts in the present for how we might imagine possibilities of tomorrow. So in order to create these images, in order to create these artifacts from the future, you all should design with those unevenly distributed pieces of the future. You should look for them, think about what they mean, and not just ask yourself what they are, but really, how do they challenge the way that we think about this space? How do they provide a new lens for us to think differently about actors, about authority, about behavior? I love this quote from the Asaro tribe in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, this idea that knowledge is a rumor until it lives in the body. New types of information, all kinds of knowledge that we have, it doesn't feel real until you really feel it. And often the images that we have in all kinds of spaces, but in particular in the cultured meat space, they don't elicit any emotional response other than, I think, disgust. What does it look like to really design images that make you feel like you're experiencing something, that make you feel excited, that make you maybe say, gosh, I would love to design a future where my kids are engaging with this type of product, or I would love to see this. You need to live this in the first person. And so much of this discourse is very, very abstract, and so many of the images are ones that I would never want to live in my body. So, how can you design some artifacts that really do live in the body, both quite literally, I guess, in this case, but also metaphorically, how do you get that gut reaction that you feel that inspires you to act? Because all of this is not to come up with speculative ideas. This is to go to the future, to come up with possible visions of what could be over the next decade, to identify more profoundly the one vision of the future that you want to build, and then backcast a strategy so that you can make better decisions today in order to create that future you want tomorrow. The last sort of, I guess, guiding principle here is there's inspiration for these types of images, these types of artifacts everywhere. You don't need to be a professional foresight practitioner in order to do this. Everyone implicitly makes visions of their possible futures in their minds all the time, but we can be better at developing a practice that pushes our notions of what's possible to their extremes. And I will tell you, we have a lot of inspiration for you to get you started. You can go on the Institute's website and find a whole host of artifacts from the future that are about food, health, technology, well-being, governance. We also have an artifact generator. This is a sort of Mad Libs where you can keep on refreshing the page and be prompted with a totally random statement. I did this yesterday, and the statement that came up was that YouTube celebrities are in a regenerative world, gene splicing with a ridiculous disinformation campaign. I have no idea what that means or looks like, but it did get me to think a little bit differently about what would gene splicing and disinformation mean for the next 10 years? Where do young people go for information? These days, YouTube celebrities have a massive influence. What does it look like if YouTube celebrities are championing a regenerative world? And how can we get that today? How can we build that today? And are there new types of outreach and communication strategies that we might need to think of when we're trying to roll out products or even just new speculative ideas? So this is a process to help you think creatively and differently by engaging with seemingly ridiculous prompts because, like Jim Dater says, any useful statement about the future should at first appear ridiculous. And the last thing I'll say real quickly is that we just launched our Coursera course. It's a futures thinking specialization for free that anyone can take to learn about futures thinking and our methodologies. And there is a component of this course on artifacts from the future and our very specific toolkit and process for how to do that. So we have all these images of the future. There's actually a space that's being designed right now called the Museum of the Future in Dubai. I went and started designing some opening exhibits for it last year, and it's going to house all of these images, all of these artifacts, all of these provocations of the future. It just won an award for being the most complicated building being designed in the world. And one of the reasons is because all of that script on the building is glass. Those are the windows. And it says, the future belongs to those who can imagine it, design it, and execute it. It isn't something you await, but rather you create. And if you want to create better futures for cultured meat, for food, for your company, for yourself, for your family, for your kids, you need to be able to first imagine them. And in order to imagine them, we need much better images of what they could be. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, concerns? Complaints go to Alex. Hi, I can hear you, and I'll repeat it. What's your question? Are you sure? No?
I feel like I'm being very greedy with my question asking today, but I love so much of that, Max. What I'm just a little bit, I guess I'm just wondering if there's certain parameters to, creating images that are ridiculous when we're talking about food that we'll bring into our body in the future, like, should there be some parameters so it doesn't seem like science fiction? Like, could we get caught out if we create ridiculous images now that alarm people? Like, do we need to be conscious of some of those things, or are you just thinking we just need to go a little bit wild?
Yeah, great question. So I think that the current images alarm people, so that's our baseline. But yes, I think we do need to be very thoughtful about not only what these images look like, but who's involved in creating them. And we want images that I think are less science fiction and more social fiction. I'm much more interested in provocative images that showcase how new social structures, new relationships, new behaviors emerge. The sort of techno, I'm 3D printing in space, this crazy thing. Those, I think, are less provocative. They're honestly just easier to do, on the one hand, but less insightful. The other thing is, this all kind of needs to be grounded in the notion that what we're not trying to do is say, this is the future, this is going to happen. These are images to help us derive insights. And the litmus test for me is ridiculousness, but really it's, does this image help you think differently? Did it somehow spark a new idea, a new way of seeing or thinking about the world? And if it sparked an insight, you had some sort of aha moment, or you're interested in thinking through it more deeply, then it I think is a good thing. I know you work in communications and are thinking about how do we ensure that this space is adopted and consumer perception is sort of managed. And I think the last question is, I don't know who the arbitrator of that is, and I guess I would love to see a diversity of these images from people around the world, of different communities who will have different expectations about their food system, who have different culinary recipes that their grandmothers used to cook for them, and that there isn't sort of any sort of one arbitrator, but instead a diversity of visions, a diversity of images. Thanks. Thanks for the question.
I've recently taken on a mentor in the form of a 2.5-year-old. And I don't think that I have ever received greater wisdom than from this 2.5-year-old who seems to know everything about the world. I'm wondering, in terms of how we start thinking differently as adults who have some kind of formation and boundaries on our thinking, whether we want to admit it or not, how do you bring in children into this? How do you cultivate a way of thinking differently that never puts boundaries on children's minds? I'm really interested to see what the future education around this. I'm interested. I want to stop asking a question and just more like put that thought into you and see what you've thought about that.
Yeah. God, that's, it's so good. Kids are ridiculous. But what I think when most people say that, I think that's not a positive thing, or it's seemingly like written off. So one of the things that I think is really challenging in professional worlds is that we don't find utility in ridiculousness. We don't value it. And kids are a great source to remind us, like, no, what you just said was actually really profound and interesting. And my mental blinders, or perhaps the image and information ecosystem that I exist in every day, has set up my expectations of this space or of this product or even just like of this interaction in a very specific way. And kids are totally unlimited in those boundaries. So I guess my first thought is just like naming that and recognizing it is really important, because if we can't all agree that kids could be a really wonderful source of information about the future or even about the present, then we're never going to get there. I'm reminded, has anyone here read The Little Prince? There's this wonderful line of a kid showing an image to an adult, and the adult sees a hat. And the kid says, no, it's a snake that's eaten an elephant. And it can be both, right? But we are so beaten into submission that like, no, that we shouldn't come up with ridiculous ideas for what could explain this. Let's go with like sort of an Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is this is a hat, and that's a hat, and that's that. So I think acknowledging it and recognizing it and seeing those types of models, and then knowing that next time you are confronted with an image of something, you can actually question what it means and what it is really profound. But the last thing that I would say is we at the Institute for the Future always look and try to incorporate kids, and the other maybe adult version of kids is artists who engage with playful and some seemingly ridiculous speculative ideas to say, how can you challenge a lot of our core assumptions about what we're thinking? We just did a very big strategic plan for a university in California. It involved a collective exercise where thousands of people submitted little forecasts, statements about what they wanted to see in the university. And the one thing that I loved, which I can very much shower praise on because I did not lead this project, but one of my colleagues brought in the kindergarten class, the kindergarten classes around the campus who would be entering college freshmen to this university if they decided to go there by the time the strategic plan was supposed to be enacted, and invited them to contribute what their visions of the future could be. And I think that those types of processes to fold in kids are really, really, really amazing, and we should all figure out ways to do it more in our work, because I think probably other than bringing your kid to work, you don't engage with them, and they're wonderful sources of information. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much. I hope you all can create some new images for the future today when you leave. Thank you.